I am a practicing dentist in the Philadelphia suburbs, receiving my dental degree from the University of Pennsylvania School of Dental Medicine, and am currently the president of the Pennsylvania Dental Association. I have grown up in the church, as my father, Reverend John A. Limberakis of blessed memory, was Greek Orthodox priest for 60 years. I have served in almost every lay capacity in the church, and more recently have become actively involved in furthering the role of women in Orthodoxy. Consequently, my brother, who is the national commander, Dr. Anthony Limberakis, appointed me and Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou as co-chair of the Archons Women in Orthodoxy Engagement Committee. And from our committee Zoom meetings, we have learned that tonight's webinar will address some of the main questions raised by the committee members about the Archons and women Archons. Our moderator for this evening's program is Dr. Elizabeth H. Prodromou. Dr. Prodromou earned her BA degree from Tufts University, a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, a Master's of Science and PhD in Political Science from MIT, that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is a visiting professor of international studies at Boston College, and she was the only female member of the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the Holy and Great Council in Crete in 2016. Our first panelist is George E. Demacopoulos, PhD, Professor of Theology, and the Father John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University. He received his BA degree from the University of Tennessee, a Master of Theological Studies from Holy Cross Orthodox School of Theology, Masters of Arts, and PhD in Religious Studies from the University of North Carolina. Along with Dr. Aristotle Papanikolaou, he co-founded Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, the only research university center of Orthodox Christianity. He was invested in 2010 as Archon Didaskalos tou Genous, Teacher of the People. Our second panelist is Aristotle Papanikolaou, PhD, Professor of Theology, and Archbishop Demetrius, Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture. He received his BA degree from Fordham University, a Master's in Divinity from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He was also invested in 2010 as Archon Prostatis ton Grammaton, Patron Saint of Letters. Our third panelist is John Fotopoulos, PhD, Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. He earned his BA from Hellenic College, a Master's in Divinity from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, and PhD in New Testament Studies from Loyola University in Chicago. He was invested in 2017 as Archon Didaskalos tou Evangeliou, Teacher of the Gospel. And at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, who will take control. You have the comm, as Captain James T. Kirk would say.
All right. Thank you, Cary. Thank you, Dr. Limberakis. Thank you to all of our speakers this evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you and also to welcome everyone who's joined us on this webinar. I'm going to be brief because we have 90 minutes together and we want to make as best use of the time as we can. I wanted to begin by saying a little bit about why we're actually having this webinar this evening. And we have decided to start the public webinar series of the Engagement Committee on Women in Orthodoxy on the topic for tonight for the simple reason that there has been a lot of conversation in diverse fora, in public fora, in smaller groups, within the Archons themselves, and in the church more fully on how to advance and support the fullest mode of participation of women in order to make us a fuller, more dynamic, vibrant church. And so the issue of women archons is a topic that has generated an enormous amount of interest, and which fits, we believe, with supporting the mission of the archons, which is to defend the Ecumenical Patriarchate, to advance the question of religious freedom, to advance freedom of conscience, belief, and religion for all Orthodox Christians and for all peoples in the world, and also for us to advance our own religious literacy. And by that, we mean learning the facts about the history, the present, and also the future of our church, and where women may fit into positions of leadership, of service, of all manner of contribution to the life of the church. We also wanted to start with this, I think, because we recognize that in terms of the Archon's mission, one of its diverse missions of defending freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, we know that worldwide, women and girls are disproportionately affected, adversely affected by violations of freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. And whether it's in things like forced conversion, forced and child marriage, abductions and sexual enslavement, dress restrictions, female genital mutilation, violations of reproductive rights, that ultimately women and girls pay a disproportionately heavy price for violations of religious freedom. So again, giving voice by women about women's issues, and as part of the larger church's voice and activism to ensure that we respect our commitment that and our belief that all human beings are created in the image of God. This webinar fits with that broader theological understanding and also commitment. So in terms of tonight and our protocol, Dr. Limberakis laid it out. Please upload your questions into the question and answer section of the on the screen. If you would like to include your name and affiliation, please do so, and we can identify you that way. Just reminding you that we'd like you to be as succinct as possible and end your question with a question mark so that we can do our best to cover as many questions as possible. And then finally, just an invitation for all of you who have joined us. If you're not yet signed up for the Engagement Committee, please do join the Engagement Committee. There are two ways to do that, either on the Archon website or through an email, which I will also put into the chat, and you can all access that. So I'm going to turn it over now to our speakers, and we're going to begin with Dr. George Demacopoulos, who will start us off for the evening. And again, thanks to all four of you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Prodromou, Elizabeth. Thank you, Cary. I'd like to thank the Archon leadership for their trust and their commitment that we have this committee and that we begin in this way. I'm going to be brief, so each of us has a specific role that we're going to talk about, and my role in this opening section is just to give a very brief history of the ancient order of the Archons. What were they? Where did they come from? To sort of lead us into how the continuity that we have with the order today. So as we all know, Jesus is born at a time when the Roman Empire has conquered Palestine. So the Christianity emerges in the very context of the Roman Empire. About 280 years after the birth of Jesus, a Roman emperor by the name of Diocletian, who was instrumental in just a complete overhaul of the structure of the empire, the way it was organized, instituted a process by which he would make government appointments across the provinces of the empire. And he instituted the officia, these specific titles for specific imperial roles, either in the city of Rome or in the provinces. And many of these titles he actually drew from classical Greece. So the history in terms of the officia and the roles begins in the 3rd century of the Christian era. But the titles that the words that he uses for the specific offices go back approximately 800 years before that. So obviously there had been in ancient Athens or where have you, there had been government roles. And so he took some of those same names and instituted them. Within a couple generations, if we remember our church history, our Western civilization, we know that the Roman Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity and becomes a Christian himself. And so what that does for the archons, for these offices in the Roman Empire, is it blends Christianity. It blends Christianity with this sort of imperial superstructure. And so the two go hand in hand, and this develops for centuries. And so the Roman Emperor Justinian and several others, I mean, you can call them Byzantine Emperor, Roman Emperor. They all refer to themselves as Roman down to the very last day, right? And so these titles, they continue to evolve and emerge. They take on different roles. And by the 8th century or so, we have titles that are specifically in the church. Sometimes those titles are conferred by the Ecumenical Patriarch. Sometimes they're conferred by the emperor. Sometimes they go to laymen. Sometimes they go to clerics only. So there's really almost, in a sense, there's almost no limit to the number of titles. There's at least a couple hundred that we have evidence for. One thing that you might want to know, the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 2016 actually published a book with all of this history that I'm recounting. It's called Titles and Offices and the Ranks in the Byzantine Empire and Orthodox Church. It was a work begun by Father Milton Efthymiou and completed by Dr. Matthew Briel, who had been a student of ours at Fordham. And so this is available. The book's available on Amazon. You might even be able to get it from the Archon office because I know they have many of them. Anyway, so I'll simply conclude by saying throughout the Byzantine Empire, so down to the 15th century, you had this continuation of these Roman offices, Roman imperial offices, but with the blending of the church, you had the two of them. And when the empire collapses, the ecumenical patriarch sort of de facto becomes the continuator of everything that had been Roman and Christian before. And so the privilege of conferring titles, all titles, fell to him. So I'll leave it there, and I think John's next.
Good evening, everyone. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks again to the Archon leadership for allowing us to have this important conversation. So I think I can kind of dovetail and pick up where my good friend George left off. And that is, so we have these offices or ranks in the Eastern Christian Roman Empire, or what we might know more commonly as the Byzantine Empire. And these ranks were reserved for men, at least for a while. So we had these masculine gendered noun titles given to men as a way to honor them and recognize certain positions and certain functions, either within the church or the state or both. And there were also women who were sometimes referred to by the same rank, but initially only in conjunction with a male relative, usually a husband or sometimes possibly a father. So you could have, for example, a man who had the title Protospatharios, so a title that conveys something that they were an important military person, that they carried a sword of some type. And then the wife would be called Protospatharisa. She would get the feminine version of that same title as a way just to honor her. But it wasn't a title that she got in her own right because of some leadership or function that she had, or because of something that she did. It was always in conjunction with a male. However, what we found through through our research and looking at these titles, there was one particular title that was given to women in their own right and not in conjunction with a male relative. And this title is called Zosti Patrikia, or in English, we might call it something like belted patrician. And this was an office or a rank that was given to distinguished women for their service to the church and the empire from the 9th to the 11th centuries, for approximately 3 centuries. And we have very good evidence of this office. It's mentioned in a couple important Byzantine texts from the 9th and the 10th centuries. And we even have some details on the service that was used that would endow a woman with this title, that would make her a Zosti Patrikia, a belted patrician. The service, just to give you just a kind of the quick outline of it, it began at a church in Constantinople, at the church of Theotokos of Pharos, or Theotokos of the Lighthouse. And the woman was given a special robe. She was given also a belt and possibly some kind of a white headdress to distinguish her from other people. There was a ritual where these garments and this belt was blessed, and this belt was placed upon her. She was also given some ivory plaques, presumably that had some kind of an engraving with her name and rank on it, and then also some legal documents that confirmed this position that she had. And then they would go in a procession from the Church of Theotokos of Pharos, and in this religious procession to the Church of Hagia Sophia, and they would enter into the church, and she would be greeted by the Ecumenical Patriarch, who would come out of the altar, receive these ivory plaques from her. He would bless them at the altar, thus also in his own way allowing the church to recognize her role, her important leadership role in the church. So we know this title and this role as an archon existed for women from the 9th to the 11th century. We know that these were women who were distinguished for their leadership and service, having both a kind of a civil role as well as a church role. And it's very interesting, even in kind of the archaeological record throughout the former Byzantine Empire, there have been found lead seals. So these kind of devices that were used to seal personal and important legal documents when they were sent. And these seals, these little lead medallions, so to speak, actually had engraved the woman's name and her officion of belted patrician on the lead seal as a way to kind of express her status, this important status of her as a belted patrician within the church. So I think the important thing to take away from this is that we did have women archons from the 9th to the 11th century. They had this special officion given to them, Zosti Patrikia, or belted patrician. They were recognized both by the state as well as by the church for their distinguished leadership. And this is something that existed for a good 300 years. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly why it fell into disuse. It was never prohibited by the church. It just kind of ceased to be, like a number of things. We could talk about that later if we want to, theories among the panel on why that may have happened. And then I think, just to kind of tie up, the last thing I would just like to mention for those who don't know, who are in the webinar, is that the archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, as a kind of a modern reinstitution of the archons, began in 1966. But what a lot of people don't know is that in the 1960s, Patriarch Athenagoras also recognized, I think the current count, and Dr. Elizabeth will correct me if I'm wrong, is 11 that we know of, 11 women in the 1960s who were given the title of Archodissa by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Now, those were typically women who were given this title in conjunction typically with their husband. But these women were very hard-working, dedicated women to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. I know of at least one woman who was given this title from Australia. So we do even have a bit of a modern precedent. Now, those women were not inducted into the Order of St. Andrew, but I think it's significant that even in the 1960s, the Patriarch recognized these women with the title of Archodissa for their service. So we have a Byzantine precedent, and we have a bit of a modern precedent for it. So the final thing for me to close is to say that when we talk about the possibility of recognizing women in our modern day as archons, it is not an innovation. It is not something new that some liberal archons are pulling out of the sky. It's something that is a part of our tradition, and something that our tradition has done for quite some time in recognizing hardworking, dedicated Orthodox women in our church.
Great, thank you, George, and thank you, John. And we're going to turn it over now to Cary. Doctor.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the history of the Archons in America. Originally known as the Knights of St. Andrew, the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle, Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, was organized on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, March 10th, 1966, as was mentioned, when His Eminence Archbishop Iakovos of blessed memory conferred upon 30 outstanding lay men of the church the various officia, or titles, of the Ecumenical Patriarchate on behalf of His All Holiness Patriarch Athenagoras of blessed memory. They were honored because of their love, loyalty, and support of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and their contribution to its advancement and welfare. The ancient Order of Archons is, in fact, the oldest and most prestigious honor that can be bestowed upon a layman in the entire Christian world. This ministry has grown over the past 58 years and has included hundreds of dedicated Archons who have given their time, talent, and treasure as defenders of the faith and supporters and advocates for our Mother Church. In the 58 years since 1966, the Order of St. Andrew, which is now called the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to avoid confusion, has grown from 30 to over 750 men. During the solemn Archon investiture service at the Archdiocese Cathedral in New York City, the Archbishop, or respective Metropolitan, confers each new Archon on behalf of the Ecumenical Patriarch with the Cross of St. Andrew, along with the official patriarchal certificate specifying the officion designated personally by His All Holiness for each Archon. The leader of the Archons in America is referred to as the National Commander. The first National Commander was Pierre de Metz, or Panayotis Dimitriou, from 1966 to 1975. Then Anthony Borden, MD, from 1976 to 1989, followed by Chris Phillips, DDS, from 1989 to 1997, and currently Anthony J. Limberakis, MD, since 1998. The Executive Committee is comprised of the National Commander, Vice Commander, Treasurer, and Secretary, who are the officers of the 25-member National Council. Regional commanders are appointed to each of the 8 metropolises of the Archdiocese and to the Archdiocesan District, and they conduct local educational meetings and symposia within their region, addressing the challenges facing and the ministries of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In addition, there are 11 engagement committees whose mission is to provide meaningful opportunities for all Archons to participate in the active and ongoing defense of the Ecumenical Patriarchate across a wide range of fields. Divided into several subject matter specific subcommittees, the Archon Engagement Committee is designed to encourage participating Archons to develop original initiatives for consideration of inclusion in the national policy. The Women in Orthodoxy Engagement Committee, unlike the others, is open to Archons and non-Archons, men and women. In 1986, the National Council established the Athenagoras Human Rights Award. The award is presented every year at the annual banquet to a person or organization which has consistently exemplified by action, purpose, and dedication concern for the basic human rights and religious freedom of all people. The award was named after one of the great church leaders of the 20th century, the late Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras I. The National Council unanimously voted in 2010 to establish the Nicholas J. Boris Award. This award is presented annually to an individual who has demonstrated extraordinary and incomparable stewardship to the Archons, enabling Archons to vigorously pursue securing religious freedom for the Mother Church of Constantinople. The award is named after the late National Vice Commander Nicholas J. Boris, Archon Deputatos, who himself had demonstrated remarkable leadership as a faithful son of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and exemplary steward of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. A patriarchal foundation exclusively dedicated to fortify the financial underpinnings of the Ecumenical Patriarchate was established in 2019 with the creation of the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew Foundation for the Sacred See of St. Andrew. The Bartholomew Foundation has a global initiative to, 1, establish a reliable, substantial, charitable foundation to fund the worldwide salvific ministries of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. 2, to increase the Orthodox Christian presence on the global stage. 3, foster increased inter-Orthodox dialogue. And 4, expand charitable and humanitarian aid. The Archons meet annually during Archon Weekend in New York City, during which the newly selected candidates are educated on the mission of the Archons, invested and given their officia following the hierarchical divine liturgy at the cathedral. The Athenagoras Human Rights Award banquet and the Nicholas J. Boris Award dinner dance also take place during that weekend. And most recently, by unanimous decision of the Holy Eparchial Synod of the Sacred Archdiocese of America, the honorable and most esteemed Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate will be recognized yearly for the feast of their celestial patron, St. Andrew the Apostle and the first called disciple of the Lord, on the closest Sunday to November 30th, the feast day of St. Andrew the Apostle. This concludes the history of the Archons in America. And now it's time to have our moderator take control and hand the microphone and video camera over to Telly, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Limberakis. I'm turning it over to Dr. Papanikolaou.
Thank you, everybody. Really great to be here. A wonderful initiative by the Archons. I'm going to broaden the scope a little bit since the committee is called Women in Orthodoxy. And I'm also going to take a little bit of a different angle. I'm a theologian, not a historian. So I'm going to take a bit more of a theological angle to it. And what I mean by that is, you know, we have a theology in our church, and our theology indicates what it is we believe. So our theology is really the teachings, the logos about God, what it is that we believe about God. The creed that we recite every Sunday, every liturgy, is theology. I mean, that is really our theology, our basic theology of the church. So when I say I want to take a theological angle to this, what I mean is the best way to do this is through an example. So, it's theology has something to do with what we say about God, right? So we can have a simple statement and say that God created the world. That's a theological statement. God created the world. We also believe that God is a good and loving God. So seeing that God is a good and loving God, what God has created is good. Creation is good. The world is good. So in taking a theological angle, what I want to do is then take that statement, right? Take that statement, God is good, God is loving, God created the world, God created a world that is good and loving. Those are all three theological statements. And ask the question then, what kind of conclusions can we derive from that basic theological statement? And in a way, I already did that. So if I say God is good and God is loving and God created the world, we draw a conclusion that the world is good, and we can draw further conclusions that we should relate to the world as something that is good. We should relate to the world as something that we should care for, that we should respect. And this is one of the initiatives of the Archons, because in the end, the Archons promote the message of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And obviously, one of the key messages of the Ecumenical Patriarch is to be the Green Patriarch and to talk about the initiative of caring for the world. So that's the thing I want to do, right? So another theological statement that we say is, if we really want to know about God, we look at Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the Word of God, and Jesus is God incarnate. And so we affirm that Jesus is both God and human. Jesus is both God and human. So we take that theological statement, and then we ask ourselves, what kind of conclusions can we derive from that statement when thinking about women's roles in the church? So let's ask ourselves. So we take God became human in order to save us. And this is how we know the true God, through Jesus Christ. That's why we're not supposed to paint icons with the Father as an old man and the Spirit as a dove, because when we ask ourselves, where is God? We point to Jesus Christ, and all we need is the icon of Christ. So when we say that Jesus is the Word of God, is both divine and human, do we then say, gee, from that theological statement, I must conclude now that women should be subordinated at all levels of society? That makes no theological sense, right? That doesn't make any theological sense, right? In fact, the church has always affirmed the opposite. So we see that Jesus himself sent Mary Magdalene first to proclaim the resurrection to men that basically really didn't get it at first. That St. Paul gives Phoebe, the saint, in the last chapter of Romans, responsibilities as deacon of the church. We see Paul saying, based on his good news that Jesus is the Word of God, in Galatians 3, that there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no male or female, all are one and united in Christ. So we see that, so we have these historical examples of these leadership positions in the church. In many ways, through those historical examples of women archons, women deacons for centuries, we see actually the church being countercultural at the time. And in that sense, the church was very brave. I mean, even though it should have expanded during that time. But so the thing is this, there really is no good theological reason. There is no good theological reason to not expand and increase the leadership roles of women in the church, including the deacons, and definitely the archons, right? It makes no for example, if I said, I believe in Jesus Christ, the Word of God, divine and human, and from there I must conclude women should not be archons, that makes no theological sense at all, zero. So we have to expand the role of women in the church is to be consistent with our deepest theological claims. And in that sense, it's really to be faithful to God. And so really the church just needs to be more consistent with what it claims to be its deepest theological beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. And if you don't mind, since we've all known each other for eons and eons, I'm going to use first names, if that's okay. I want to encourage, first of all, everyone who has a question to please upload your questions into the Q&A. I see one thus far, but I want to just pitch one question to all of you and then turn it over to our viewers. And I really appreciate the way that you've all seamlessly woven together history and theology, giving us a sense of the long history, imperial and ecclesiastical history of titles in the church, the specificity of the order of the archons, its origins in the Byzantine period, the fact that there were both men and women who were archons, and then the particularity of the archons in the United States. And then closing out, I think, Telly, you gave us a wonderful sort of synopsis of why it is that our theology itself calls us to think about the kinds of questions that the Women in Orthodoxy Engagement Committee is going to be dealing with. And one of those is the question of women archons. So I want to ask you all just a very simple question. Why, from your perspective, do you think that this moment is a particularly significant or important moment for thinking about broadening the way that women participate in the church, including possibly in terms of the office of the archons? And by the way, thank you as well to the Archon leadership for supporting tonight's webinar. So for any of you, why do you think that this is an especially ripe moment and in some ways a really important historical conjuncture for thinking about the ways that women have participated, why it is some of those roles fell out of practice, and how what we're talking about in many ways is a restoration and a contemporary expression of roles that existed historically? I throw that out to any of you for your thoughts. Why now?
Well, I'll start. I mean, there's no question about it that the reason why we're addressing this has something to do with the fact that the wider culture, especially in the West, has also considered the question of, expansion of women's roles throughout sort of at every level of society. Now, the reason why I mention this is that in our church now, we get some people who might be saying, well, we're the Orthodox Church, we don't change from the beginning, which is categorically false. So we don't change from the beginning, and we can't allow the pressure of society somehow to dictate what we believe. And of course, I just walk through, I mean, this idea of stating what we believe and figuring out the conclusion that's most consistent. But I also want to say this. For people who say that we can't allow the pressure of society to kind of change what we believe, that's not consistent with our history either. And I'll allow John and George to sort of chime in on this. Because, after Jesus ascended, his disciples kind of went out and had to confront, they confronted obviously fellow Jews who didn't sort of believe he was the Messiah, but they also went out and had to talk about Jesus to Gentiles and to Greeks who also weren't easily convinced, right? And as the centuries progressed, there's a sense in which as they were preaching this, they were being asked questions. They were being asked questions. And they didn't say to themselves, oh, we can't allow the pressure of these questions and we're not going to answer them or respond to them, or we're not going to sort of talk about them, or we're not going to somehow think about what's good that's coming from these societies. They didn't do that. They listened, they heard these questions. Of course, they argued against Greek pagans and Greek pagan philosophy, but also they also kind of absorbed what was good from these non-Christian cultures. And I think today, for us to kind of lay up these guardrails when we're being challenged or we're being asked questions from the larger society is in some ways, again, not consistent with our theology, but also not really consistent with the way in which Orthodox Christian history played out.
Thank you, Tully. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
So I can. So to directly answer your question, like why now, right? Telly's answer is the right one, right? I mean, we all see in the broader West that women have risen to the highest levels of politics, of the corporate world, right? Of science, right? There's no I mean, it's not full equality, but it's completely different than it has been even 50 years ago. But I would add a wrinkle to that too, which is that anecdotally, I can say that there are a lot of young women who are so frustrated with what they see in the church that there is no that they see a sort of lack of female leadership and a lack of opportunity for themselves. They find they have a very hard time seeing themselves in a future that is sort of presented them as a sort of wall of men in black, right? And so I think that I think the question why now, it's in part it's a response to what's going on broader. I think in part it's because we see so many of our own extremely talented young women just throw up their hands in frustration. Um, and I think it's because we have so many women doing such great work for so long, like you, Elizabeth, and like so many others, that we really, as Telly said, we have to be true to ourselves, and recognize more fully than we have of late. We need to recognize their roles as such.
If I could jump in too real quick, I would just say, very simply, women are, I mean, Telly talked about the theology, women are equal to men, and they deserve to be treated as equal to men. And so this is an avenue that is not currently open to women, and there doesn't seem to be a very good theological or historical reason why that avenue should remain closed. With that having been said, just to kind of bring things together, I'm sure many people on the Zoom saw the article a few days ago in the New York Post with a headline titled "Young Men Leaving Traditional Churches for Masculine Orthodox Christianity in Droves." And the article talked about how masculine the Orthodox Church is, as though this is a positive draw that is going to really increase the numbers of adherents to Orthodox Christianity. What the article didn't consider was how many women are leaving the Orthodox Church because they don't feel that they have a viable role in the church or in some of their parish communities or at the diocesan level, especially in other jurisdictions some of the roles open to women are much more restricted than maybe what some of us are familiar with in our own parishes and here in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. So I think we really need to consider how women are feeling in our parishes, and especially to our daughters. Those of us that have daughters, I think really have a kind of a very close sense of the way that they perceive some of the things. And some of those things they perceive may not be completely accurate, but a lot of those perceptions indeed are. And so we really need to think about ways that we can include young women and women already actively working in the church and recognize their leadership and service, things that they are already doing. So it seems like there's really no good reason not to talk about this and think about ways we can move forward with it.
Elizabeth, can I jump in here? I want to tie to something Telly and something John said together with a little more history, if I can. So Telly rightly observed that the earliest church was in many ways countercultural to the Roman world, right? And John mentioned this frankly silly article in the New York Post that came out earlier this week. One thing I think people might not quite understand is the ancient world, Greece and Rome, and frankly, ancient Judaism, they weren't just patriarchal. They were systemically misogynistic. And I don't say that lightly, right? The Aristotelian notion of gender was there was only one. There was only male, right? Because women, in Aristotle's words, were not human. Okay. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, was just as bad. These men were deeply, deeply, deeply misogynistic. Hippocrates is literally the one who introduced the idea that a woman should be kept barefoot and pregnant and at home, should never be out in public, should never speak, right? Should never be seen. That their roles, because he had this notion of their physiognomy, that they were incapable of rational thought, that the only thing that they could do was, the only thing that they could productively do for society was raise children. Aristotle thought the exact same thing, that women should not have education, that they should produce as many children as possible, and they should never leave the home. What you have to understand is everything about the ancient world was deeply, deeply misogynistic. So when Paul is sending a woman with his most important theological letter, the letter to the Romans, he is making an extraordinary statement, right? When Paul is saying in Christ there's neither male nor female, sorry, when Paul says this, it's an extraordinary countercultural statement. And when we have people today who try to champion what they consider traditional male-female roles, right? The husband works, the wife stays at home, right? This sort of fictitious traditional family, what they don't realize is they're not channeling some kind of early Christianity. They're channeling Aristotle. They're channeling Hippocrates, right? They're not doing anything to channel early Christianity, because early Christianity repudiated all of that.
This is great, and I want to turn this over. We have a couple of questions, but if I'm understanding all of you correctly, I mean, first of all, part of what our engagement committee is trying to do is broaden our understanding and our education, our basic literacy when it comes to the history of Orthodoxy and how we live and practice our faith. And I think what all of you are doing is reminding us that when we talk about Christianity, we're talking about, a radical proposition for understanding what it means to be human and our relationship with all the created world. And I really love that you're forcing us to remember that to be Christian is to be countercultural. It's to be courageous. It's also to be prayerful and discerning. And so one of the things I would ask all of us to sort of ponder is, why is it? So as we're learning facts from you all, these are historical facts and theological facts. Why is it, do we have any sense of why it is, for example, like an office of the female archon fell out of use? Because what you're telling us is that it did exist. So to be talking about it isn't, some sort of postmodern, innovation. It's a return to and a recovery of, in contemporary times, of what existed historically. And so much of this is true for other offices for women in the church. Do we have any sense of why it is? And I think I probably am expressing a query from everybody, why it is that that office fell out of use, and why it is that oftentimes mistakenly some believe that there was a theological justification, when in fact it sounds like this was more an issue of practice and context.
Well, maybe I can start, and I don't know if George wants to add anything that I leave out, but I would just say, those centuries there where we have women with this officion of belted patrician. It's a time in the Byzantine Empire where we have a lot of smaller families who are acting, if I can use a modern word, they're acting in kind of they're engaging in entrepreneurship. They are getting ahead in new ways, families that don't come from the old aristocracy, new money, new opportunities to rise in social status, and that includes women. So it's very interesting that the church is recognizing changes that are happening in the culture at the time with women who are rising in status, affluence, career, and they're figuring out a way to use those gifts also in conjunction with the church. And it's at that same time we have the order of women deacons in full swing. And about the same time, we kind of see the end of belted patrician as far as we know it, and the end of women deacons in that period. And it may be because of some cultural changes, possibly because of the Crusades that are happening, and we have demographic changes, different theological impulses, different ideas about women that are entering into the Byzantine Empire. So we don't know the exact reasons, but it's probably a number of different historical and cultural forces that just kind of cause those things to go away, including with the ordination of women deacons, because we no longer have a particular liturgical style we call the cathedral rite versus the monastic rite. The cathedral rite, a different kind of liturgical worship in church, also falls away at that time. And so there's just the same avenues for women's leadership are no longer open to women because of those various changes. George, I don't know, did I leave anything out?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it seems that, and John's the one that really did most of this research, but so I'll remind him of it. It seems that the belted patrician falls out about 100 years before the diaconate. And John's absolutely right. I think the diaconate falls out because of the Fourth Crusade and the end of the cathedral rite. But one of the things one of the things about this particular officia was that it was conferred by the emperor himself, whereas frankly the majority were not. And you had a dynastic change. In the 11th century, you went from the Macedonian dynasty to the Comanian dynasty, and it may simply be the case that Alexius Comeni, it wasn't something that he was going to continue. Although, frankly, his daughter is probably the most famous Byzantine woman alive, right? Anna Comeni. And so maybe it's just the dynastic change. I have no better explanation than that.
All right, well, thanks to all of you, because we have actually two questions in the chat and you've sort of answered them. Gavrielia Constantine and Teva Regal both ask about whether or not, we have any understanding of why this, order fizzled out, which is what one of the questions asked. But then both of them sort of touch on this as well. They ask, what, from your perspective, what would have to be done and changed before the role could be, or the office could be restored, whether it's in the form that, you've spoken about, John, or some other form? What, from all of your perspective, needs to happen in order to live our theology, as Telly put it so beautifully, be faithful to our teachings and to our practices?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first things we have to do is just be aware and discern how it is we might be using theology kind of to serve our own self-interest, right? So that means all of us. I mean, either everybody on the Zoom or and everybody within the Orthodox Church. I mean, people will engage in all kinds of theological gymnastics to kind of really justify, any number of things that really, in my theological judgment, aren't necessarily consistent with the central claim that, God became human. In other words, the incarnation. So one example of that outside the Orthodox world, but perhaps maybe even with some inside the Orthodox world, is that sure, God became human and there will be a last judgment. And given the fact that there will be a last judgment, that there will be judgment, that the earth really is just kind of here for us to kind of live on for a while and really has no real value to it, right? But again, I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to, you asked one of the reasons why, the office fell out of use and the diaconate fell out of use is that at some point, I think that in people's brains, there had to be some kind of theological rationale about why this somehow seemed to make sense. And that's why I think it takes tremendous discernment for us to really kind of be aware of how we may bring our own self-interest into certain kinds of conversations. In this particular case, I think the discernment that's really happening is that, again, that we really haven't been true to our central claims, and in many ways we've been allowing sort of hardened ideas in the West over centuries of women's roles across all levels of society to somewhat be theologically justified within the church as if it was just simply a given. And I mean, we're here to complicate things, complicate our history, realize that to some extent our theology is complicated, but when in another sense, it's really not. It's really not. I mean, it's very, very simple. There's God, and God wants to be with us. And God is with us in Jesus Christ. So when we look at that and we understand that, we have to just constantly ask ourselves, right? Are we being consistent with this very, very central claim of our theology? And when it comes to women in the church, there have been moments when the church has been, right? And we're pointing out there has been a moment when the church has been. But for the most part, the church hasn't been faithful to this central claim when it comes to women.
Anyone else amongst the speakers who wants to jump in? Because there's another associated question. This is from Jean Novas Busano, and this is directed to you, Telly, but I think anyone can answer it as well. It says, you mentioned women archons and deacons in the church's history and the theological justification for their roles. What about women priests?
Well, I answered her in the chat, but I'll say it here. I mean, personally, this is a larger discussion, but personally, I don't see any theological rationale preventing women from being priests. I don't see any theological rationale for that. Now, anyway, there will be people who will claim that we're having this discussion. By having this discussion, that's where we're going to open some kind of Pandora's box somehow, and that's where it's going to lead. But I mean, again, that doesn't make any sense either, because just because we allow for women to be archons, we allow for women to be deacons because of both the theological and the historical convergence, I would say, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to, that this is all kind of a setup somehow for us, kind of a backdoor setup to ultimately have women be ordained. I personally, and it's me, I personally have thought about this for a long time and just don't see how there is any theological justification for it, for keeping women from being priests. But that doesn't mean that these other discussions, again, which have theological and historical convergence to them, means that somehow we're kind of use these discussions as some kind of backdoor attempt, as if that's the ultimate prize.
If I could just jump in here too and just say, I think, it's easy to kind of conflate things. When we're talking about women archons, we're talking about a role in the laity, a leadership role for a lay person. It's not an ordained ministry. So it's a completely separate issue. We could have a conversation another day or an argument if we want to have that about women priesthood, because we've never had women presbyters, women priests as part of the Orthodox tradition. But we have had women archons who are lay people, and we have had women deacons who are ordained members of the clergy. So I think it's a way it conflates the discussion. It's a way of saying, well, we can't do this because one thing will lead to the other, and then it may ultimately lead to something that we've never had before, and then we're not Orthodox anymore. So that's I think it's maybe getting ahead of ourselves. We have certain things that are part of our tradition, and I think conversations like this give us a forum and an avenue to be able to discuss and to educate and to think through issues and to really consider what are the reasons that are kind of hindering us from doing some of the things that we should do. And I mean, to be sure, the Orthodox Church moves slowly. Stability, tradition, historical connections, those are wonderful aspects of the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Christian tradition. But as I think Tally said earlier, and maybe George too, this idea that the Orthodox Church never changes is an absolute fallacy. Yeah. It has changed. It does change. It is changing. It will change. And the question is how it's going to change. Is it going to change in a way that is consistent with our tradition, theology, and the values that we lift up in Scripture? All human beings being created in the image and likeness of God, male and female, God created them, or are we not?
All right, and thank you for reminding us that, these are separate, if possibly related questions. And the question of reinstating female archons and the associated questions of ordained roles for women. But I think the important takeaway for us then is that we need to learn to talk about all of these issues and not foreclose any kind of conversation. It's only through conversation that we can do the kind of, discernment, prayer, and research that you all are talking about that will produce decisions that are good for the church and what it's trying to do in the world. On that note, I have two other questions here. One is, it's a short question. Do we have a definitive list of 20th century female archons who were granted the officium by the Ecumenical Patriarchate? These were all, by the way, by Patriarch Athenagoras, or any other patriarch. And I'll let you all answer. I know 11 for sure, but I don't know if there are more. But the 11 in the US, that is. I don't know of, others outside the US, but you all may. I think, John, you mentioned Australia.
Yeah, there's one from Australia, so that would make 12. But so I think the answer is no, we don't have a definitive list. I think those of us involved in have been kind of working on getting it, but I'm not sure that, Elizabeth, maybe you know more about this than I do. I'm not sure that we have all the pieces to the puzzle yet. I would imagine there's some other names out there that we just don't know about for sure yet.
Cary, do you have any other information on that?
Yes, I just wanted to add that currently the Archons do not have an archivist. We don't have archives per se. That's on the agenda to be discussed and formalized. And so consequently, a lot of research needs to be approached and find evidence. Like you said, who and what are the names of the 11 female archons from the 60s? Now, a registrant posed a question regarding possible investiture of an archon in Zimbabwe. And to my knowledge, I am unaware of that. I'm not even quite sure which order that person would be assigned to. I
But that would
mean,
also be the Patriarchate of Alexandria, which
that
would
is correct.
be
Right,
a
right.
different thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a totally different jurisdiction. So that's what I wanted to talk about as far as the lack of archives that we have, but that's being pursued.
But we do have paperwork on the 11. I know that for sure. And then on a related note, this is a statement, I'll kind of reframe it as a question, that Archbishop Elpidoforos has been recognizing women in leadership by investing them with men as senators of Orthodoxy and Hellenism. And is this a step forward towards recognizing women as archons? So I don't know the answer to this. I'm not even sure what senators are. So maybe you can share, the panelists can tell us a little bit about what are senators and whether or not, as the judge asks, if this is a step towards reinstating.
I have to admit, I don't know anything about this.
No, I just saw something, I think at St. Nicholas, at the Feast of St. Nicholas, they did it for the first time.
Yes.
I absolutely think it's a great step. It's a tremendous step. So, and I think our Archbishop has been really great in promoting women as much as possible throughout the Archdiocese. And so he's allowing us to have this wonderful conversation as a way of continuing to move this conversation forward. And as you beautifully said, Elizabeth, to just continue to discern prayerfully through research these questions, because, and that is a step forward. The fact that we're even talking about it. I mean, 20 years ago there wasn't any discussion on this, so I know it's not enough. I absolutely know it's not enough, but I'm glad that we're talking about it.
Yeah, and I would like to learn more about this Office of Senators too, as well. And if this is something that, this goes back to George and John, your presentations. If this was an office that at one time existed in the church, and it's now being reinstated, recovered, then that is encouraging,
Well,
because
Rome did have a
Senate.
Senate, and so did the Byzantines.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We will
Even
avoid-
when it was an empire, right? Even after Augustus, when it becomes an empire, they still have a Senate, right? And even Constantinople has a Senate.
Right.
During-
Hopefully we won't see the days where a horse ends up in the Senate again.
Yeah.
For those who know that part of history. But here's another question, which is related, I think, to to living theology, which is what we're all talking about. This comes from Inga, and she says, would you agree, this is to Telly, but I think, again, more broadly, would you agree that the response to the challenges that you all outlined when it comes to women's place in society and politics, and also in the church, would you agree that the response to these challenges lies in the realm of theological anthropology? And if yes, how do we go about a response through theological anthropology?
Well, I think the answer comes in many forms. One is to be aware of the fact that in the West, we have gone through centuries where religion has slowly but surely come under some kind of critique and attack. So that the culture that we live in, that the critique has had an effect. I mean, the critique has had an effect on the role of religion within society, its presence, its power, its impact. And so it sort of gives the impression that some of the other ways of thinking about life that have emerged from that, from the modern West, somehow are tethered to this critique of religion. And one of them has to do with women's rights, and especially in the United States, which sort of really got percolated around the 70s. And so there is a knee-jerk reaction to thinking through some of these issues in a way that also that people try to present it as some kind of defending of the faith, right? So we're defending the faith against this kind of culture in Western society that seems to have critiqued religion, and religion seems to be going downhill, or it seems to be diminishing in power or presence. And somehow women's rights and women's liberation, or thinking about different ways, thinking about differently about women's roles throughout society, has something to do with this critique. So in order to defend ourselves and defend what orthodoxy is, or defend what Christianity is, we have to kind of create this diametrical opposition between our faith, our church, and this Western culture. And you know, we just have to be aware that to be a Christian, in my opinion, anyway, I mean, part of the spiritual challenge within our Orthodox faith is not to create these dualisms, right? I mean, if you think about God becoming incarnate, you know, you have God and you have like a human being or creation, and somehow they're united, right? That's the most anti-dualist statement that you can have in the world. And so I think it kind of points to the fact that, you know, we can have our opinions, we can have our judgments, but we can't see like Western culture as the enemy, right? As that thing that somehow is out to get us. And so I've lost, you know, I've got to be honest, Elizabeth, I've lost a little bit of the thread of the question, but so I'm just rambling here. But the point is that one of the things we have to kind of really be aware of is that we can't have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to, you know, to liberal culture, to Western culture, to quote unquote woke society. I mean, as Christians, I think we have to take a spiritual stance that ultimately listens and tries to discern what is good and godly, even when we're listening to those who don't share what we believe, because maybe they can open our eyes to something within our faith that we haven't quite seen before.
Can I jump in, Elizabeth?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So building off what Telly's saying, that was really helpful, actually. It's very much the case that the majority of the feminist discourse today is secular, right? But as somebody who studies the history of ideas, right, like in the very long scope, what's almost ironic about that, or at least to me intriguing about that, is that it is Christianity, right? It is the New Testament that introduces to the world the idea that men and women are equal, right? There had been no previous society that had lived or thought that that was true. I mean, as I mentioned, the ancient Greek philosophers didn't even think women were human, right? And so it's Christianity that gives birth to the idea that women are equal and should be treated equally, even if Christianity didn't always live up to this in the Middle Ages, right? And so Telly's right. I mean, so many people will hear the kind of cause that we on this group are advocating for, and they will just immediately dismiss it as liberal and secular and godless and all of that. And what we're struggling, frankly, to convince people of is no, like advocating for women, we are being as traditional to Christianity as we possibly can be, right? It was what St. Paul is doing in Galatians and in Romans, and what Jesus is doing in encountering the most marginalized women and speaking with them in public, completely, and I mean, this is John's world more than mine, but completely and utterly scandalous the way that Jesus engages and welcomes and embraces women, right? Our advocacy for greater roles for women in the church, for women in general, it is being as traditional and frankly conservative within the history of Christian ideas as possible. So
Yeah, I thank you for reminding us, both of you, of that. I think, you know, we oftentimes fall into the conceptual traps in this sort of West-East binary of thinking that, as you said, advocating for the fullness of the church, which means roles for women, that somehow that's a Western invention or innovation. And yet we oftentimes forget that Christianity, or people forget, those who would argue that, forget that Christianity begins in the East, in the context of what is the East. Christianity begins in Asia, in West Asia, and it spreads westward. And that when we talk about human rights as universal, again, that's not some sort of, you know, Western innovation. Human rights and the idea of the universality of human rights originates, as you're all telling us, with Christianity itself. And so that we are returning to the tradition, and we are trying to recover and live more fully a tradition that is part of the church itself. And that includes the defense of the most vulnerable. And so here I would like to ask you on that point again about why now, and why it may be, you know, important to be talking about women archons and women more broadly in the church. If we think about, as I mentioned at the outset, the disproportionately negative impact of violations of human rights on women and girls, I wonder if you all might, you know, have anything to sort of observe about why it's important then for women to participate in conversations about and deliver relief and support and action on some of the worst kinds of human rights violations that affect women and girls. I mean, I'm thinking about what's going on in Sudan, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the Holy Land, now in Syria, what's going on in China, in Myanmar. Any thoughts on, again, why now and why it might be a really important time in terms of women having a voice on these issues, Orthodox women having a voice on these issues?
Well, maybe I could chime in with the words of Jesus. Jesus, talking to some of his listeners, says that you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you do not know how to interpret the signs of the times. So it's almost like saying you could look up at the sky and you could figure out if it's going to rain, or if it's going to be a nice day, or if it's going to be a storm, but you don't look around and see everything happening and realize these are signs for you to interpret and act. So I would say, just based on all the examples that you gave us, Elizabeth, I mean, these issues are very timely, very important. They involve not only issues of life and death, but I think emotional, psychological health and wellness for women in our churches, how they perceive their relationship, not only with other human beings with whom they relate, but maybe most importantly, how they relate with God. If they don't feel welcome and they have a place in the church, and the church is advocating for them, then we have a big problem. Then we as a church are perpetuating socio-religious systems that are actually harming women. And so, in order to be true to our calling, to be a holy nation, a royal priesthood, the people of God, as we're told in the New Testament, we have to advocate and we have to work to make a difference. And if the church isn't making a difference in its own interactions with its own women members of its church, then we're not being true to our calling.
Yeah, I mean, just to right there in terms of not being true to our calling, it's never too late for the church to be the church. Yeah, it's just, I mean, and to do everything that we've been talking about, in my opinion, is the church being the church. So,
Well, on that then, on being church, I think we're coming to the end of our webinar, but there are two questions about how we can be church and specifically action items. And those are Barbara and Teva asking, what would the path forward look like to reinstate women archons? Or what would it take to invest women as archons? Does the Ecumenical Patriarchate just have to do it? Are there other things that have to happen? And I thank all of you as archons, and then our two judge archons that I saw in the chat as well, Judge Ted and Judge Steve. Action items. Let's close with how we can act.
well, I'll leave the logistics to those who kind of know that better, but I would say that keeping this conversation going, spreading the word that the conversation is happening, and not giving up hope, right? Spreading it to as many people within the church, but especially the women, and having them speak up to their priests, having them speak up to their bishops, writing letters to the Ecumenical Patriarch or the and the Archbishop. I would say, it shouldn't end here. This webinar, in many ways, is designed to empower people to raise their voices within the church. So I think that's one path forward.
Okay, keep talking, keep hoping, keep acting, right? That's our-
Educating our faithful is most important, and what is the key to this engagement committee. And we do plan to continue with Zoom meetings next year on different topics that the engagement committee raised. To us, there's 3 other topics that we want to pursue. Not ignoring this one, to say the least. This one is a ongoing conversation, and I think a groundswell of enthusiasm will begin with the 46 people who have attended this. They'll spread the word. The recording will be available. We'll let you know when that will be the case. And as Elizabeth said earlier, if any of you are interested in joining the engagement committee, the Archons Women in Orthodoxy Engagement Committee, you are more than welcome. I will say it's not easy to conduct a Zoom meeting when there are 50 or 75 people going on at the same time, but we have managed to form discussion groups within the meetings and clarify and crystallize some of the issues and questions that we've raised. So unless there are any other questions, I see a couple more questions popped up, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think one was, similar to the others, but also a concluding comment was from Commander Limberakis, from Anthony, Dr.
Yes.
Anthony Limberakis. He said that he tells us that, we need to keep this goal of reestablishing women archons on the front burner, and then also that this was one of the reasons that the executive committee established the Women in Orthodoxy Engagement Committee. And he also mentions that at the end, it'll be the decision of His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. But this is something that the Archons have brought to his attention, and I think we know we'll continue to bring to his attention. So thank you for everybody for chiming in on this and making it clear that this is not only a conversation, but it's a conversation that's been and will continue to be accompanied by action.
Can I just say real quick to Elizabeth, for all the women that are on the webinar, and especially some of the younger women, just to kind of a shout out to them. Not only thanks for being on the webinar, but just to really encourage them to try to use their gifts for the church. We need you. We need you in the church. We want you in the church. The church needs your gifts. The church is not church without you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Cary, I leave it to you to close us out.
Well, I want to thank our panelists, John, George, and Telly, and our moderator for doing a superb job illuminating us on the different aspects of this conversation. There are many, many perspectives, and I think we covered historical, theological, and cultural as well. We posed some questions to get the gears rolling in your head to think about where we go from here. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing conversation. It's not ending here, and we will keep you all apprised when the next webinar is being planned. So stay tuned, and I thank you all for joining us. Any other concluding remarks of panelists?
Thank you.
Thank you.
For having us.
Well, we
Cary,
thank you.
can I offer
Yes.
one last informational point? I put the long and somewhat cumbersome email address in there for all of you. If you want to become part of the committee, you can also go to the Archon website. And as soon as you send us your name, we'll plug you into the spreadsheet. You'll get all announcements about the committee. We've organized the committee in terms of 4 working tracks, so that we can have working groups that can address these different kind of issues and their intersections. So we'll send you that organizational structure as well, and we're open to any input and suggestions. It's a work in progress, and we're all happy to be part of it. So please join, and please, just like tonight, where we've been men and women and every generation, that's the fullness of the church, and that's what we're striving for in terms of this engagement committee.